My beloved child, something shifted yesterday in a way no one around your soulmate expected, and the strangest part is not simply what they chose to risk for you, it is what happened inside them the moment they realized there was no comfortable way to take that choice back. Until yesterday, the third party believed they understood the situation. They believed they knew where your soulmate stood, what they would protect, what they would avoid, and exactly how far they were willing to go when your name entered the conversation. There had been enough hesitation in the past to make that assumption feel reasonable. Your soulmate had learned how to appear composed. They knew how to change the subject at the right moment, how to keep certain feelings hidden behind ordinary words, how to convince everyone around them that whatever existed between you could remain contained. But yesterday, something happened that quietly destroyed that illusion. It did not begin with a dramatic scene. It began with a choice so small from the outside that another person might have missed its importance completely. Your soulmate was given an opportunity to remain comfortable, and they did not take it. They were given a way to protect the version of their life everyone had become accustomed to, and instead, they moved toward the one thing they had been trying not to reveal: how much you actually matter to them. Don't skip, because the risk was not reckless, and it was not some impossible gesture designed to impress you. It was far more personal than that. They risked being misunderstood. They risked disappointing someone whose opinion had influenced them for longer than they wanted to admit. They risked allowing a private truth to become visible before they felt completely prepared to explain it. And once they made that decision, the third party noticed something immediately. Your soulmate was no longer asking what everyone else thought they should do. They were asking themselves a different question: if I keep choosing everyone else's comfort, when do I finally choose what feels true to me? That question changed the atmosphere. Imagine the quiet after words like that. No shouting. No dramatic confrontation. Just a silence in which everyone suddenly understands that something has moved beyond discussion. Your soulmate had spent so much time trying to find the perfect moment to become certain, yet yesterday they discovered something unexpected. Sometimes certainty arrives only after you take the first honest step. And they took it. Not because everything became easy. Not because every question disappeared. They took it because continuing to pretend that you had not affected them deeply had finally become harder than admitting that you had. The third party never saw that coming. They had mistaken patience for weakness. They had mistaken your soulmate's silence for agreement. They had mistaken every delay as proof that your soulmate would eventually let this connection fade quietly into the background. But there was something they never understood. Silence can hide many things, yet it cannot erase what a person keeps returning to when nobody is watching. Your soulmate kept returning to you. In memories. In unfinished conversations. In small details. In the strange way certain songs, places, words, and ordinary moments seem to circle back toward something you once shared. They tried to explain it away. They tried to be practical. They even wondered whether enough time would make the feeling easier to ignore. Instead, time did something entirely different. It removed the noise around the feeling until your soulmate could finally recognize what remained. You remained. Not as an obsession. Not as a fantasy. As an unanswered truth. And yesterday, that truth was placed directly in front of them. Something important is waiting for you here, because what they risked was connected to a boundary they had never crossed before. Someone close to them expected a familiar answer. The conversation had reached the point where your soulmate was supposed to reassure everyone that nothing significant was changing. They were supposed to smile, soften their words, and make the room comfortable again. They almost did. For one brief moment, the old instinct returned. Keep the peace. Say less. Explain nothing. Let everyone assume what they want. But then your soulmate remembered something about you. Not a grand memory. Something painfully simple. A moment when you had been honest even though honesty made you vulnerable. Perhaps it was something you once said without knowing how deeply it would stay with them. Perhaps it was the way you refused to force what needed time. Perhaps it was the way your presence made them feel seen without demanding that they perform for you. Whatever the memory was, it changed what happened next. Your soulmate stopped protecting the misunderstanding. And with a calmness that surprised even them, they made it clear that your place in their heart was not something other people could casually define. That was the risk. They allowed themselves to be known. There is a difference between having feelings privately and standing beside those feelings when another person questions them. Yesterday, your soulmate discovered that difference. And this is where everything became more complicated, because after the conversation ended, they expected relief. They expected the kind of calm that usually follows finally saying something you have carried too long. Instead, their emotions became stronger. They walked away replaying every sentence. They wondered if they had revealed too much. Then they wondered why revealing the truth should feel like too much in the first place. They thought about you. They imagined what you would say if you knew what had just happened. They wondered whether you had any idea that, somewhere outside your view, your name had become the reason they finally stopped shrinking their truth to fit somebody else's expectations. Stay till the end, because the person losing control is not losing control in some chaotic sense. They are losing control of the careful emotional distance they had spent so long maintaining. The walls are becoming harder to hold in place. Their old explanations are no longer convincing them. And the more they think about yesterday, the more one realization keeps returning: they did not defend a temporary emotion. They defended something they believe deserves a real chance. That realization frightened neither their heart nor their future. It clarified them. Yet clarity can be intense when it arrives after a long season of hesitation. Suddenly, choices that seemed unrelated begin connecting. Why did they keep checking for signs of you? Why did certain conversations with other people leave them feeling strangely empty? Why did they compare emotional safety with the way they once felt around you? Why, every time they imagined making a meaningful change in their life, did some version of your presence appear somewhere in that picture? They had tried not to ask those questions all at once. Yesterday forced them to. And one answer kept appearing beneath every question, because this mattered more than they had admitted. The third party sensed that answer too. That is why their reaction changed. At first, they assumed your soulmate was simply emotional. Then they waited for them to soften their position. They expected a message later saying, "Forget what I said. I was overwhelmed." That message never came. Hours passed. Your soulmate did not take the words back. Instead, they became quieter, and that quietness carried a completely different energy from before. It was no longer the silence of someone hiding. It was the silence of someone deciding what comes next. There is a moment in many meaningful relationships when the question shifts from, "How do I feel?" to, "What am I willing to do because of what I feel?" Yesterday may have been that moment for your soulmate. Think about why that matters. Feelings can remain private forever if someone chooses comfort above honesty. But when a person begins adjusting decisions, boundaries, conversations, and future plans around what they know in their heart, the connection has entered a deeper territory. Your soulmate understood that yesterday. And after understanding it, they could no longer return completely to the person they had been the day before. Something subtle had changed in their posture, their thoughts, their patience. They became less interested in explanations and more interested in truth. Less interested in appearing unaffected and more interested in understanding why you had affected them so profoundly. There was even a moment later that evening when they reached for their phone. They did not immediately contact you. That is important. This story is not about impulsiveness. Their hands simply hovered there while 1,000 possibilities seemed to gather around one simple action. What would they say? Would they tell you what happened? Would they admit that your name had become the dividing line between an old version of themselves and the person they were becoming? Would you understand what it cost them emotionally to finally stop allowing someone else's opinion to determine how openly they could care? They opened something connected to you. Maybe an old message. Maybe a photograph. Maybe a conversation they had revisited more times than they would ever admit aloud. And there, in the privacy of that moment, something inside them softened. Not because they suddenly had every answer. Because for the first time, they stopped demanding that every answer arrive before they allowed themselves to acknowledge what was already true. You had mattered. You still mattered. And yesterday they behaved like someone who finally knew it. But there is another detail, the one the third party still does not fully understand. Your soulmate did not risk that comfort merely to protect a memory of you. They did it because they have been quietly considering something forward-looking. Something involving a conversation they know can no longer remain postponed forever. Something they have rehearsed in their mind, changed several times, abandoned, then returned to again. The risk yesterday was not the final move. It was preparation. A threshold. The first visible sign of a decision that had been developing in private for much longer. And this is where you may recognize something within yourself too. Perhaps you have wondered whether silence always means absence. Perhaps you have questioned whether someone can care deeply while appearing uncertain. The answer is not always simple, because healthy connection requires actions, honesty, and mutual willingness, not only hidden emotion. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that as well. Feeling something is not enough. They know eventually they must communicate with clarity. They must show up in ways that do not leave you guessing forever. And strangely, yesterday's risk seems to have awakened that responsibility inside them. They cannot demand that you understand what they have never expressed. They cannot expect you to wait inside an unanswered question. That realization may be the deepest reason their composure is slipping now. They are beginning to see the connection not only through the lens of what they want, but through the lens of what you deserve: honesty, consistency, and the freedom to make your own choice once you know the truth. That is a more mature kind of love than simply longing from a distance. And it changes what may happen next. Late yesterday, after the conversations had ended and the world around them became quieter, your soulmate came back to one sentence. It was not something the third party said. It was something your soulmate had said themselves earlier in the day, almost without realizing the weight of it. They replayed the sentence once. Then again. And when they heard their own words in memory, they suddenly understood why everyone in the room had gone silent. They had revealed more than they intended. Hidden inside that sentence was not merely a defense of you. It sounded like a decision about you. That is what shook them. That is what the third party had not anticipated. And that is why today your soulmate cannot return comfortably to pretending yesterday was just another conversation. Something crossed a line. Something became real enough to require a next step. They know it. The third party knows it. And somewhere inside this unfolding story, there is still one detail you have not heard: the exact thing your soulmate was protecting when they chose to risk that comfortable relationship yesterday. Because it was not only your reputation. It was not only their feelings. They were protecting a possibility. A possibility involving you that they have quietly carried much longer than anyone realized. And the moment that possibility was finally spoken aloud, even indirectly, the entire meaning of yesterday changed. There was one sentence your soulmate never expected to say out loud, and the moment it left their lips, even they seemed surprised by how certain it sounded. It happened after the room had already grown quiet, after the third party had tried to bring everything back into familiar territory, after your soulmate had been given one last opportunity to soften what they had admitted. They could have laughed it off. They could have called the entire conversation a misunderstanding. They could have protected everyone from the discomfort of realizing that something had genuinely changed. Instead, your soulmate looked at the situation differently than they had before and said something simple enough to be missed by anyone who did not understand the history behind it. They said they were no longer willing to make important choices based entirely on what other people were comfortable with. That was the moment. Not dramatic. Not loud. But unmistakable. Because the third party understood immediately what those words meant. Your soulmate was not merely defending you anymore. They were reclaiming the right to decide what place you might have in their future. And strangely, once they said it, they could not stop thinking about everything they had postponed because they were waiting for outside approval. Conversations they almost started with you. Truths they almost admitted. Moments when they felt close enough to reach out but convinced themselves that waiting was wiser. Opportunities they allowed to pass because they wanted certainty without vulnerability. Yesterday forced them to see the cost of all that hesitation. They began asking themselves a question they had avoided for a long time: what if the greatest risk was never choosing you? What if the greater risk was continuing to wait until there was nothing left to misunderstand, nothing left to protect, nothing left to say? That realization stayed with them long after everyone else had moved on. Don't skip, because the possibility they were protecting was more grounded than you may think. They were not secretly planning some impossible grand gesture. They were protecting the possibility of finally having a real conversation with you without allowing another person's expectations to decide the outcome beforehand. Your soulmate wanted one honest chance. A chance to tell you what changed. A chance to explain why they became distant when part of them wanted to come closer. A chance to acknowledge that silence may have created an impression they never intended. Most of all, they wanted the chance to discover what could happen if both of you were allowed to speak without anyone else interpreting the connection for you. This is why yesterday mattered so much. For the first time, your soulmate protected the conversation before it had even happened. They defended your right to hear the truth directly from them. And when the third party realized that, something about their confidence shifted. Until then, they had believed your soulmate could be persuaded through enough questions. Are you sure? Is this really worth changing things for? What happens if it doesn't work? Those questions had influenced your soulmate before. Yesterday, they landed differently. Your soulmate listened, but instead of becoming smaller under the uncertainty, they recognized something important: every meaningful choice carries unanswered questions. Waiting for a guarantee had never brought them peace. It had only delayed honesty. Then came an unexpectedly gentle moment. Your soulmate did not become defensive. They did not try to prove that anyone was wrong. They simply admitted that they needed to make this decision themselves. That calmness unsettled the third party more than any argument could have, because calm conviction is difficult to negotiate with. It showed that this was no temporary reaction. Something had been forming quietly beneath the surface. Something the third party had not noticed because they were watching your soulmate's words while ignoring their patterns. And those patterns had been telling the truth for months. Your soulmate remembered details about you other people would probably forget. They noticed when your energy changed. They wondered how you were doing during ordinary moments when nothing reminded them of you directly. They carried questions they wanted to ask you. Sometimes they imagined running into you unexpectedly and wondered whether they would be able to behave as casually as they once promised themselves they would. Sometimes they pictured hearing your voice again and felt an immediate softness they could not explain away. None of those moments seemed decisive on their own. Together, they became impossible to dismiss. Something important is waiting for you, because yesterday your soulmate finally connected those scattered moments into one realization. They were not struggling to forget you. They were struggling to decide whether they were brave enough to be honest about remembering you. That difference changed everything. For so long, they had treated the emotion itself as the problem. Yesterday they understood that the emotion was not asking them to abandon reason. It was asking them to stop pretending reason required them to deny what mattered. That insight was surprisingly peaceful at first. They sat with it quietly. They felt lighter. Then another realization arrived, and this one was harder to ignore. If they wanted honesty from you someday, they would need to offer honesty first. They could not arrive carrying half explanations. They could not tell you only the convenient pieces. They would need to admit why they waited. Who influenced them? What they were afraid of losing, not fear in some dark sense, but the very ordinary human fear of disappointing people, changing expectations, and stepping into a future that could not be perfectly predicted. They would need to acknowledge that perhaps you had felt the consequences of decisions you were never included in. That thought made them pause. For the first time, your soulmate considered how everything may have looked from your side. They remembered moments when you might have wondered whether you mattered. Moments when their hesitation may have appeared like indifference. Moments when silence may have answered questions they should have answered themselves. And instead of defending their behavior internally, something changed. They felt responsibility. Not shame. Responsibility. A quiet awareness that if they ever return to this connection, they must return differently. More transparent. More consistent. More prepared to let action support what words are saying. That is where the loss of control truly begins. Not with chaos, but with an old version of themselves becoming impossible to maintain. Your soulmate had built an entire system around staying measured. Feel something? Wait. Want to say something? Think about it for days. Miss you? Distract themselves. Wonder if you still care? Tell themselves it is better not to know. Yesterday disrupted that system. Now every familiar defense seems to produce the same question: how much longer am I going to hide behind this? The question followed them through the evening. It appeared while they were doing ordinary things. It returned when the phone lit up. It came back when the room grew quiet. At one point, your soulmate caught themselves imagining a conversation with you in unusual detail, not the fantasy version where every sentence is perfect, but a real conversation where there might be pauses, awkward honesty, unanswered questions, and perhaps even moments when neither of you knows exactly what to say. Surprisingly, that imperfect version felt more meaningful to them than every perfect scenario they had created in their head. Because it was real. And that is what they are beginning to crave now: reality. Not assumptions. Not third-party interpretations. Not endless speculation. A real exchange between two people who have been carrying different sides of the same story. The third party noticed this shift too, although they interpreted it differently at first. They assumed your soulmate was becoming stubborn. But later, something happened that challenged that interpretation. Your soulmate asked them a question. Just one. If this were truly meaningless to me, why would I still be thinking about it after all this time? There was no easy response. And perhaps that silence answered more than words could. Stay till the end, because what happened after that question reveals why yesterday may have become a turning point. The third party stopped trying to convince your soulmate that the feelings were temporary. Instead, they asked what your soulmate actually intended to do. That was new. Until then, every conversation had centered on whether your soulmate should move toward you at all. Suddenly the conversation became about how. Your soulmate noticed the shift immediately. They did not answer quickly. Their expression changed. Their thoughts seemed to move somewhere deeper. Because for all the private rehearsing, all the imagined messages, all the possible conversations, they had not expected anyone to ask them directly what action they intended to take. And the answer that came to mind surprised them. They did not want to send you a dramatic declaration. They did not want to arrive with promises larger than either of you could reasonably make. They wanted to start with truth. One message. One conversation. One honest acknowledgement of what had happened and what they had realized. Your soulmate understood that anything meaningful would need to grow from there naturally. No forcing. No predetermined ending. just enough courage to open the door that hesitation had kept closed. That thought calmed them, but it also made everything more immediate. A dream can remain safely in the future. A simple message can be sent today. And suddenly they had no enormous obstacle left to hide behind. Only themselves. That is why they are feeling so unsettled now. The decision has become smaller, clearer, and therefore harder to postpone. They do not need to solve the entire future. They only need to decide whether honesty deserves one step. Your soulmate knows the answer, yet knowing and acting are different experiences. Their fingers hovered over their phone more than once. They opened your contact. Closed it. Returned later. Wrote a few words. Erased them. Not because they changed their mind about you, but because they were trying to find language that did not sound rehearsed. They wanted you to recognize them in the message. They wanted it to feel human. They wanted you to understand that something had changed without being overwhelmed by everything they had carried privately. Then something unexpected happened. Your soulmate stopped trying to write the perfect opening. They realized perfection was another form of delay. The first words did not need to explain everything. They only needed to be true. That realization brought them closer than ever to pressing send. Yet right before they did, they remembered the risk from yesterday and understood something even deeper. The risk was never simply standing up to the third party. The real risk was becoming accountable to the choice they had made. Once they openly defended the possibility of you, they could no longer pretend they were powerless. They could no longer say circumstances alone were keeping them away. Yesterday placed responsibility back in their hands. And responsibility can feel overwhelming when someone has spent a long time telling themselves there is nothing they can do. Now your soulmate knows there is something they can do. They can speak. They can clarify. They can listen to your side without trying to control the answer. They can offer you the respect of truth and accept whatever reality comes from that conversation. That is a very different kind of courage than dramatic pursuit. It is quieter. More mature. And perhaps that is why something inside them is finally ready for it. The third party, meanwhile, is beginning to realize they may have underestimated you too. They expected your influence on your soulmate to weaken with distance. Instead, distance seems to have revealed which feelings were temporary and which continued returning. They assumed your soulmate would eventually choose familiarity over uncertainty. Instead, familiarity started feeling like a cage built from other people's expectations. They assumed your absence would make your significance smaller. Somehow, it made certain truths easier to see. But there is one thing the third party still does not know. Yesterday was not the first time your soulmate almost chose you openly. There was another moment earlier, quieter, hidden from everyone when they came incredibly close to reaching out. Something stopped them then. And whatever happened during that earlier moment may explain why yesterday they refused to be stopped again. Your soulmate remembered it suddenly last night. They remembered where they were. They remembered what they had written. They remembered the exact reason they deleted the message instead of sending it. And when that memory returned, they finally recognized how much their life had changed since then. Because the reason that once felt powerful enough to silence them no longer feels convincing. In fact, when they looked back at that unsent message last night, they noticed one line they had completely forgotten writing. One line that sounds very different now, after everything that happened yesterday. And the moment they read it again, they realized the possibility they had been protecting was never new at all. It had been waiting quietly beneath the surface for far longer than anyone, including your soulmate, was ready to admit. The forgotten line was only a few words long, yet when your soulmate saw it again last night, they stopped scrolling completely. I still want to know what this could become. They had written those words during a much earlier moment, back when admitting even that much felt almost too revealing. At the time, they erased the message because they convinced themselves that wanting to know was not enough reason to change anything. They told themselves that curiosity could pass. That emotion could settle. That if they waited long enough, life would eventually make the decision for them. But life did not make it for them. Time passed, circumstances shifted, conversations came and went, and somehow the question remained. What could this become? Last night, your soulmate stared at that old sentence with a completely different understanding. They realized they had spent so much energy trying to avoid one uncertain possibility that they never noticed how much certainty had quietly formed around something else. They had never truly stopped wondering about you. That realization did not make them rush. It made them still. Deeply still. Because now they could see yesterday's decision for what it really was. It was not a sudden rebellion against another person's opinion. It was the visible result of an inner conversation that had been happening for much longer. The third party only saw the final moment. They did not see the weeks of questioning that came before it. They did not see your soulmate repeatedly beginning to accept one version of the future and then feeling something inside them resist. They did not see the strange little moments when your soulmate would finally think they had moved beyond the uncertainty, only for an ordinary reminder of you to bring the unanswered question back again. And perhaps most importantly, they never saw the moment when your soulmate quietly admitted to themselves that the problem was no longer whether they cared. The problem was what they were going to do with that care. Don't skip, because the answer beginning to form inside them now is not about chasing an imagined outcome. It is about no longer avoiding an honest beginning. Your soulmate is understanding that there is a powerful difference between saying, I know exactly where this will lead, and saying, I believe this deserves a truthful conversation. The first asks for certainty nobody can promise. The second asks only for courage, respect, and openness. Yesterday, your soulmate finally became willing to offer those things. And the third party was not prepared for that. They had built their confidence around the assumption that your soulmate needed permission. But yesterday revealed something quietly transformative. Your soulmate does not need permission to be honest about their own heart. They still value advice. They still care about people close to them. They are not becoming reckless or dismissive. They are simply beginning to understand that listening to others is very different from surrendering every personal decision to them. That distinction is changing the entire emotional landscape around you. Earlier today, your soulmate remembered another conversation that suddenly looked different in hindsight. Someone once asked them what they wanted, and rather than answering directly, they described everything they did not want. They did not want complications. They did not want misunderstandings. They did not want to disappoint anyone. They did not want to move too quickly. They did not want to feel exposed. At the time, those answers sounded practical. Now they recognize what was missing. They never said what they did want. That omission matters. Because sometimes a person can spend so much time avoiding discomfort that they accidentally build an entire life around avoidance instead of desire. Your soulmate is beginning to see how often they did exactly that. And when they finally ask themselves the question without qualifications, what do I actually want, your presence appeared immediately. Not as a completed story. Not as a guaranteed ending. As a conversation worth having. A connection worth understanding. A truth worth treating seriously. Something important is waiting for you in that distinction, because your soulmate is no longer framing you as a disruption to their life. They are beginning to wonder whether ignoring what they feel has been the greater disruption all along. Think about how strange that realization must feel. For so long, they believed keeping distance was the safer, calmer choice. Yet the distance never created the peace they expected. It simply replaced one kind of uncertainty with another. Instead of wondering what might happen if they spoke, they began wondering what they were losing by staying silent. Instead of protecting themselves from one difficult conversation, they carried dozens of imagined conversations inside their mind. Instead of allowing reality to answer the question, they kept trying to answer it through assumptions. Yesterday interrupted that cycle. Now, for the first time, the idea of talking to you feels less frightening than the idea of never knowing what honesty might have changed. There was a moment today when your soulmate almost laughed at themselves. Not because any of this is unimportant, but because they finally recognized how complicated they had made the first step. They had imagined needing the perfect explanation, the perfect timing, the perfect emotional state, the perfect response from you. But meaningful conversations rarely begin perfectly. Sometimes they begin with something as simple as, "There's something I should have said a long time ago." Your soulmate considered those words. Then another version. Then another. Each time they tried to make the message more impressive, it sounded less like them. So eventually they stopped. They placed the phone down and asked themselves what they would say if there were no audience, no third party, no fear of being misunderstood, no need to sound certain about things they were still discovering. The answer was surprisingly soft. I don't want silence to speak for me anymore. That sentence stayed with them. It carried everything they had been struggling to explain. Silence had spoken for them for too long. Silence had made choices on their behalf. Silence had allowed other people to assume what they felt. Silence may even have taught you lessons about them that were never entirely true. And now they are beginning to understand that if they want anything different, they must eventually replace silence with clarity. Stay till the end, because this is where the third party's position shifted again. Earlier, they had been focused on whether your soulmate was making a mistake. But after watching their calmness remain steady, they started asking different questions. Not challenges. Questions. Have you really thought this through? Your soulmate answered yes. Do you know what you're going to say? They admitted they were still deciding. And what if you don't get the answer you hope for? That question landed differently. For a moment, your soulmate went quiet. It was the kind of question that once might have sent them back into retreat. But yesterday had changed something important. They realized that honesty does not guarantee the answer you want. It gives both people the chance to respond to what is real. And strangely, accepting that made your soulmate feel stronger rather than weaker. They finally understood that reaching out responsibly would not be about controlling your reaction. You might need time. You might have questions. You might see things differently now. You might even have boundaries they need to respect. Your soulmate knows that. Yet they also recognize that uncertainty is not a reason to hide the truth forever. It is simply part of what makes truth meaningful. So they answered the third party calmly, "Then at least I'll know I finally showed up honestly." That answer changed the conversation again. Because suddenly this was not about winning you. It was about becoming the kind of person capable of meeting you honestly. And perhaps that is the most important shift of all. Your soulmate is no longer measuring success only by whether everything unfolds exactly as they hope. They are measuring themselves by whether they can act with integrity, clarity, and respect. That makes their next step more grounded than anything they imagined before. They do not need to overwhelm you. They do not need to make enormous promises. They do not need to convince you of anything. They need to speak clearly enough that you finally know where they truly stand. Then they need to listen. Really listen. To what the experience has been like for you. To what you need now. To whether there is still something here worth exploring together. That listening may matter even more than the confession itself. Your soulmate is beginning to realize they have spent a long time imagining what you might feel without giving you the opportunity to tell them directly. They assumed. They interpreted. They filled in the blanks. And some of those assumptions may have protected them from disappointment, but they also prevented real understanding. So now another thought is growing inside them. Perhaps the conversation they have been preparing for is not primarily about finally telling you everything. Perhaps it is about finally making space for your truth too. That idea softened something in them. It made the future feel less like a test and more like a meeting point. Two people bringing what they have learned. Two different experiences of the same connection. No performance. No pressure. Just reality. The third party could feel that maturity in the way your soulmate spoke, and something unexpected happened. Their resistance softened. Not completely. Not instantly. But enough that they stopped treating you like an abstract problem and started asking what your soulmate actually valued about you. That question caught your soulmate off guard. For months, they had been prepared to defend the connection. They were not prepared to describe it. And when they tried, they discovered the answer was not built around anything superficial. They talked about the way they felt more honest around you. The way certain conversations seemed to continue in their mind long after they ended. The way you could sometimes notice something in them before they found the words for it themselves. The way your presence had made them think differently about what emotional safety could feel like. They mentioned your patience. Your depth. The fact that you never needed to dominate the room to be remembered after leaving it. As they spoke, your soulmate realized something else. They had never actually said these things aloud before. They had carried them privately for so long that hearing their own voice describe you made the connection feel suddenly more tangible. And the third party noticed. They did not interrupt. They simply listened. When your soulmate finally stopped, there was another silence. But this one was not tense. It was reflective. Almost as though the other person was meeting your importance for the first time through the way your soulmate described you. Then came a sentence your soulmate did not expect to hear. The third party said, very quietly, "You sound different when you talk about them." That observation followed your soulmate long after the conversation ended. Different how? Softer? More certain? More present? They did not ask. Maybe they already knew. Some emotions become visible not through dramatic words but through how a person's entire energy changes while speaking. Your soulmate has become increasingly aware of that. They can control the exact language. They can choose how much to reveal. But there are moments when their face, their pauses, the way they remember details, the way they protect the dignity of the connection, those things reveal something words alone cannot hide. And now that someone else has noticed it, your soulmate feels strangely exposed. Not in a harmful way. More like a person who has spent years standing behind a curtain only to realize the light has been showing their outline the entire time. That is why they are losing control, now in the most human sense of the phrase. They are losing control over the illusion that they can keep this emotionally neutral forever. They can still choose their actions carefully. They can still move slowly. They can still respect whatever happens next. But they can no longer convincingly tell themselves that you are simply one more person they once knew. Something deeper has remained. And now that truth has been spoken into a room where someone else heard it, pretending otherwise feels almost impossible. Later, your soulmate returned to the old unsent message again. This time they read the entire thing from beginning to end. Parts of it felt overly careful. Parts felt like someone asking permission to feel. But one section stood out. They had written about wanting to speak with you once everything became less complicated. Last night they almost smiled at that phrase. Once everything becomes less complicated. How long had they been waiting for a life without complexity? Life had continued being life. People had opinions. Timing remained imperfect. Emotions remained layered. Responsibilities continued. And still, beneath all of it, the question of you survived. That was when your soulmate understood something simple. Perhaps the right moment was never going to arrive with a sign saying everything is easy now. Perhaps the right moment would simply be the first moment when honesty became more important than avoiding discomfort. Yesterday may have been that moment. And today, that understanding has begun to shape an actual choice. They are no longer asking whether they should ever speak to you. They are asking how to speak in a way that respects everything both of you have lived through since the silence began. They have considered starting with an apology for what they left unclear. They have considered starting with the truth about yesterday. They have considered saying nothing about the third party at all and simply acknowledging that they have been thinking differently. Yet beneath every version is the same intention. No games, no emotional performance, no pretending the past did not matter. Something real. Something simple. Something that opens a door without demanding you walk through it. And that may be why they have not sent anything yet. Not because the desire has disappeared. Because they are trying to make sure the message comes from their clearest self rather than from the emotional intensity of the moment. That pause is different from their old hesitation. The old hesitation asked, "How can I avoid this?" The new pause asks, "How can I approach this well?" That distinction matters more than it may seem. It shows that your soulmate is not returning to the same cycle. They are trying to break it. And breaking an old cycle often looks quieter than people expect. It looks like choosing a different sentence. Allowing a different conversation. Refusing to let another person make your emotional decisions. Taking responsibility for the impact of your silence. Accepting that someone else has the right to respond freely. Your soulmate is beginning to understand all of those things at once. That is why yesterday's risk feels larger today than it did in the moment. They thought they were only standing up for one possibility. Instead, they may have started changing the way they make intimate decisions altogether. The third party has noticed that too. And here is the detail nobody expected: rather than pushing harder, they eventually said something that completely changed your soulmate's emotional state. They admitted that perhaps they had been too focused on protecting your soulmate from disappointment and not focused enough on whether avoiding every uncertain situation had actually been making them happy. Your soulmate did not know what to say. For all the tension around your name, they had never expected that person to question their own role. Suddenly, yesterday was no longer a simple story of one person standing against another. It became something more nuanced. Two people realizing that influence can become too heavy even when it begins with good intentions. Two people recognizing that care does not always mean choosing for someone. And your soulmate understood something almost immediately: the third party was beginning to let go. Not of concern. Not of their relationship. Of control. They were beginning to accept that whatever happens between you and your soulmate must ultimately be discovered by the two people actually living it. That realization changed the atmosphere completely. Your soulmate had spent so long preparing to push against resistance that they had never imagined what would happen if the resistance simply moved aside. And when it did, there was nowhere left to place the responsibility. No one left to blame for the delay. No external barrier large enough to explain continued silence. Just a phone. Your name. And a choice. Your soulmate looked at the screen again. This time they did not open the old message. They began writing a new one. The first sentence came quickly. The second took longer. Then they paused over the third because it contained something they had never said to you directly. Something about yesterday. Something about why they finally defended the possibility of speaking with you. And just as they were deciding whether to leave that sentence in, another message appeared on their screen, something completely unrelated on the surface, yet connected to you in a way they could not ignore. They stared at it for several seconds. Because the timing was unexpected, and the name attached to that message belonged to someone who knew a piece of your story your soulmate had never heard before.